You are listening to the Primitive Intelligence Podcast. I am Kurt, your host. This is episode 404, Moonspiracy. I like coming up with these names now. Moonspiracy. So today, I got a message from my buddy Jason. And if you guys like outdoor videos, check out Backpacking with Jason on YouTube. And he's on Instagram and he's in some other spots too. But Backpacking with Jason. He said, hey, I've been listening to the podcast. Really like it. And I said, well, hey, is there anything you want to hear about a conspiracy? And he's like, yeah, the moon landing. I want to hear about the moon landing. So that's already been something I've been thinking about. So I've already done, this is another big one. So I've heard about it for a long time. So I've already got a pretty good running start on this one. I figured, I get this together. I get it out there. And then I'm going to probably do once a week now. I want to get like 4 of these out, 3 or 4 episodes out pretty quick. Bang, bang, bang. Just so anybody new to Primitive Intelligence has got some new stuff to listen to as I get stuff rolling from here on out. You're also going to notice a difference in the music on this one. I was using a creator-friendly, copyright-free service for podcasters and video, and apparently I was using the license wrong. I didn't see anywhere under where I had to download a license for every instance that I used it. So I uploaded the first video, didn't have a problem. Uploaded 402, and it hit me with the copyright claim. So I was like, hey, you hit me with the copyright claim. And I'd already uploaded 403 by the time I had seen the copyright claim. Like, it took a couple days. So they emailed me back and like, oh, you got to download a license for each one, which you only get so many downloads a month. So I was like, oh, this is going to start to be a problem. So I got 2 new licenses. I updated the licenses for 402 and 403, and they cleared the copyright claim on 403, but they still hit me with 402. So I just reached back out to them like, hey, what's going on? You still hit me with this one. You won't clear it. So I'm just going to stop using that service. I'll use the music I'm using now. But that's it. We're not talking anymore about the pre-game here. We're getting right into this episode because there's a lot to unpack with Moonspiracy. Episode 404, the Primitive Intelligence Podcast, starts now. Poor moon. The moon just can't get any love. So we're going to get into the moon landing hoax. And can you hear my chair? Is that loud? We'll get into the moon landing stuff, the hoax, the conspiracy behind that in a second. But I want to talk about a couple other things because the moon does have some weird things going on with it. I admit that. Like it rotates at the same speed it revolves. So the same side is always facing us, which is really weird. And during a solar eclipse, now, the moon is much smaller than the sun. Now, we're going to assume for this episode that the Earth is round. So don't hate me because I'm using this model. But for the moon landing hoax, we have to assume the Earth is round and the moon is further than 6,000 miles away. So you're just going to have to bear with me on this one if you believe otherwise. So the moon is much smaller than the sun and much closer to the sun. But when it passes in front of it for a solar eclipse, it's the same size. Or appears to be the same size. That's weird, right? So there are some weird things. There's also some other things I've seen where people do a lot of math about the rotation and the speed and the distance and the circumference and all this stuff, and it always comes up to some weird number, and it matches like the Fibonacci sequence or something like that. I'm not going to get into all that, but there's some weirdness with the moon, absolutely. But now you got people, like in the olden days, they thought the moon was made of cheese, right? They see faces in the moon. They think the moon makes you crazy. There's also the belief that the moon is an alien probe or a spacecraft, a station that's sitting up there. It was placed in our orbit just to watch us. That's creepy. And then there's people who believe that the moon isn't even real. It's a hologram. Now that one's got me confused because I'm not big on the Bible. I'm not going to lie, but I did do a little research, and the moon is mentioned in the Bible, and it is in ancient texts. So it's been there for a long time. Who's got a hologram projector that A, runs that long, and who had that technology thousands of years ago? Somebody's been lying to us. And for what reason? Why make us think there's a moon there if it's not really there? That makes no sense. So those are all just kind of fun ones, right? The mini Moonspiracies. But the big one, the moon landing hoax. Did we land on the moon? I mean, I didn't, you didn't, we didn't, but did humankind land on the moon? So let's look back at the history of the moon landing, and we're going to go back to the 1950s, 1960s. It's the heat of the Cold War. I guess when the heat of the Cold War is wrong, but the heart of the Cold War. And by 1962, there had already been satellites put in orbit. The Soviet Union got Sputnik up first. Soviet Union got Yuri Gagarin to space before we got Alan Shepard up to space. So we weren't going to lose the moon. Like we weren't losing anymore. So in 1962, President John F. Kennedy was at Rice University giving an address to a stadium full of people talking about the space race, talking about why we should do it and what we need to do. And this is the address where he gave the famous line, "We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard." Like that's a great, if that was a speechwriter or that was him, that's great, man. I mean, that got people really behind this. Like they wanted to go to the moon now. And I feel bad for NASA. I mean, NASA's already the center of a few different conspiracy theories, but I mean, they were only around for 4 years. They were founded in 1958. Now they've been around for 4 years. They finally got the doors open. You know, they got the new government branch smell out of the office, and now they're being told, "Oh, within 8 years, you got to get us to the moon." So a lot of things had to happen, and a lot of hard work was put in. Lives were lost. I mean, a lot happened on both sides, not just in the U.S., but in the Soviet Union as well. This was not an easy task. And now we were fighting each other, like literally trying to beat each other to the moon. And we only had 8 years to do it. In July 1969, you got 3 men sitting in a capsule on top of a Saturn V rocket, a huge rocket. Buzz Aldrin, Neil Armstrong, Michael Collins, they are Apollo 11. They're getting ready to go to space. They launch, they do an orbit and a half around the Earth, and they get the go-ahead for what is called translunar injection, which basically means you're going to the moon. And they start their 3-day trip from the Earth to the moon. They make it to the moon. They get there, right? The big step right there. And they make it to the moon. There was only, I think, the second manned mission to the moon, to orbit the moon. And then I think the first one was Apollo 8. So they get into orbit. All the things that they tested in Apollo 8, they had gone ahead. They kind of knew, like, all right, we know it can kind of be done. So they get ready to go. Collins stays in the command module because someone's got to monitor communications and be there for them to come back and do all the, everything from that end. And Aldrin and Armstrong get in the lunar lander. They go down to the moon. They weren't sure they were going to make it. They almost had to abort. They only had about 30 seconds of fuel left going down to the surface before they touched down. And they were probably about ready to abort and go back up to command module and say they couldn't do it. But they get down there. They do all their checks. They get everything ready. And then Aldrin and Armstrong come out of the lander. Armstrong comes down first. And a great decade for sayings, for phrases, for things to say. Armstrong comes down. He touches the surface of the moon. He says, "One small step for man, one giant leap for mankind." And they're on the moon. We're on the moon. Mankind has made it to the moon. They spend almost a full, kind of weird to say it this way, but Earth Day on the moon, about a little over 21 hours. And during this time, they're in and out of the lander module. They can't spend an entire 21 hours straight out on the surface of the moon, but they got to go in, change what gear they're using, rest, eat, drink, things like that. So they get done, they plant the flag, and they take off. They go back up to the command module, they meet up with Collins, and they head back to Earth. Between 1969 and 1972, there were 7 total manned missions to the moon. Between Apollo 11 and Apollo 17, the only one that didn't make it down to the moon was Apollo 13. And there was a catastrophic decompression of a tank on the way to the moon. It damaged the modules. They couldn't risk going down. They had to abort the landing. They used the command capsule as a lifeboat, and they just kind of slingshot it around the moon. They didn't know any of that was going to work. For all they knew, they were going to go straight past the moon, and we would have lost them into space. And who knows what would have happened if that would have actually happened. But they make it back to Earth. And then you got 14, 15, 16. And then in December of 1972, Apollo 17 is the last manned mission to the moon. When they come home, we don't go back. And this is where the conspiracy picks up. Why have we not been back? If we can get there, if we know how to get there, we know how to get there safely, and we know how to get back and get back safely, why haven't we been back to the moon? Did we ever even go? Did we get to the moon and we were the first humans there, but maybe it is a spaceship for other people, right? For another race. And we got there and they're like, hey, look, we know you're spending a lot of money on these rockets. How many do you have made? Oh, you got 6 more of them? Okay, when those 6 are done, you're done. Don't come back. All right, did that happen? Or, who knows? Maybe we stayed up there. Maybe we keep sending people up there and we got a base on the other side of the moon. I don't know. Neither one of those lend themselves to the main conspiracy, though. Did we even go? As with any good conspiracy theory, there's got to be a motive for the theory. Why would this be covered up? There's a few different reasons. I've looked, and there's really 3 that stand out. There may be more, and if you can think of one, let me know. But the 3 main motives I see was that the Vietnam War was going on, and people didn't really want America involved in it. A lot of Americans didn't want to be involved in it. And the space race was a good way of keeping people's minds off it. One of the key parts of this part of the conspiracy would be if the Vietnam War and the space program ended at the same time or near the same time, and they kind of did. The problem with that train of thought, though, is that NASA, 2 years prior to Apollo 17, so almost immediately after we went to space the first time, announced the wind down of the Apollo program. They already knew they were going to wind it down, and they did it on schedule with Apollo 17. So was it convenient that was going on at the same time as the Vietnam War to keep people's minds off of that? Yes. Was it the reason for it? I don't think so. The next motive would be the space race, right? So this is kind of the same concept as when you're a kid. Your buddy says, I got a Matchbox car, and you're like, well, I got a remote control car. And he's got, well, I got a remote control plane. And you're like, oh, well, yeah, now my dad's got a real plane. And then your buddy's like, well, my dad's got a space shuttle. And you're like, it just keeps on growing, right? Basically, that's what they're saying. The space race is to blame. Russia said they could get a satellite into space. So we said we could get a satellite in space. And they said they could get a man in space. Then we could get a man in space. And then they said they want to go to the moon. We're like, we're going to go to the moon. And then we got ourselves so deep in that we just decided we're going to fake it. It's an interesting theory, but I'm pretty sure that was the case. At some point, the Soviet Union would have been like, hey, you know what? We didn't do any of this. And they're going to leak all that information out, and they're going to make the American government look like a bunch of fools, saying they didn't do it either. They're just lying to try to keep up with us, and we're not doing it. But as far as I know, that never happened. The third motive that I've seen was money. Money and fame. This has got so many holes in it for a motive for the space race that it's ridiculous. So this would be fantastic if it weren't for a couple things. First of all, if it was money and you're having a hard time funding NASA, NASA was only 4 years old when Kennedy made his speech. They could have easily just shut it down. There was a precursor to NASA called NACA, N-A-C-A, and I think that was started in 1915. It was like the National Administration for Administrative Commission of Aeronautics or something like that. National Administration Commission of Aeronautics. I think that's what it was. But they very easily could have just, if they were going to fake the moon landings, they could just kept it under NACA and not gone with NASA. Like, there's no reason to start a whole new branch. But you were actually making rockets and launching them to somewhere, even if you were just launching up into the upper atmosphere and then letting them come down to the ocean to make people think we were going to space. They weren't cheap. You were spending trillions of dollars. That's like a South Park episode. Build rockets? Question mark? Profit. No, it doesn't work. That does not work. So I don't think it was money, and it sure it was not fame or prestige or recognition, because yeah, sure, great. People are like, oh, there's astronauts on the moon, but we could have very easily just been like, well, we don't need rockets. I mean, yeah, sure, the Soviet Union's going to use rockets, but we invented teleporters. And then they could have just like edited a teleportation to the moon, and people would have believed that just as well. So I don't think it was money. You spent more money faking the moon landing than you would have made faking the moon landing. So that's ridiculous. So let's get away from motives because they're just not working. What about the evidence? There's got to be evidence. So there's a lot to unpack with the evidence here. So I'm not going to do my standard, like, let's look at it and then, say this is what they're saying, and then this is why it's crazy, and this is why it might be legitimate. We're just going to go through them, and I'll look at them each line and do the same thing with them. Instead of going back, there's just too much to do it that way. Radiation, just getting to the moon. People say, well, the radiation belts, the Van Allen belts, would it either kill the astronauts, and at the very least, would it destroy the camera equipment? Okay, that's true, if they weren't shielded. They used aluminum and gold, I believe, to shield the astronauts, and all the equipment wasn't just laying. It's not like you're going on vacation, you're throwing your camera in the back seat. They were in shielded metal containers to keep them shielded from the Van Allen belts, from all the radiation. Now, here's the other thing. We knew the Van Allen belts were there, and therefore we could kind of try to navigate around them, take a trajectory to the moon that went through them as little as possible, and that's what NASA did. They went through them as little as possible with the shielding and the limited time they were going through them. The closest Van Allen belt is the most dangerous, and they were only in it for a few moments. I think like 12 minutes or something like that to go through it. That number I don't remember exactly the time. They didn't spend a lot of time in there, and the shielding was sufficient to keep them safe. Plus, there was probably medication they took as well. So, radiation, all right, that can be explained. So once they get there, there's no blast crater from the lunar module landing. It didn't kick up any dust. The astronauts left footprints, but the lunar module didn't make an impression, and it was so heavy. So the moon dust being kicked up and the blast crater, I saw a calculation where because of the reduced gravity, the moon only has 1/6 of Earth's gravity. With what the weight of the lunar lander would have been in the moon's gravity, with the diminished fuel and the size of the nozzle and all that, it was only putting out like 1.5 pounds per square inch, which is basically it didn't need much. So there would not have been a lot of disruption. And as you got closer, I think the engine shut off. There was like I remember there's like a pin that stuck down, and as soon as that touched, the engine shut off, and that stuck down pretty far below the lander. So as soon as that touched, engine shut off, and it dropped to the ground. Now, what about the footprints? Right. So yeah, the astronauts left footprints. Why didn't the lander leave impressions? Well, that has to come down the surface area. If you've ever snowshoed before, you know that when you are walking on snow, you just sink in if you're just wearing regular shoes. But if you put on snowshoes, you increase the surface area, which means your weight per square inch of the surface that you're standing on has been lessened, which makes you seem lighter to the snow. Doesn't actually make you lighter, but it just spreads out your weight in a larger area. Same thing happens. The lunar lander had big discs on the legs, which like big landing pads, which would spread out the weight of the lander. And it did sink in a little bit, but not as much. When you look at the astronauts who are significantly lighter than the lunar lander, even though they had their heavy spacesuits on, but they've only got a footprint, like their feet is the only thing they're putting their weight on. Now you take that and you cut it down to the fact that those boots had tread, which means your full weight isn't spread out over your shoe until your tread is completely till even the grooves are touching the ground. That's what creates footprints. So why did they leave footprints? Because that's how physics works. There was also a lot of talk about the landscape. There's spots where they would take pictures that they'd say they're in one spot in this picture, and in the next picture they're somewhere else, but the landscape looks the same. It's the moon. We have no visual reference, and especially then, we had no visual reference of what the moon was actually going to look like. And if you're comparing what's in the background from picture to picture, you could move a fairly significant distance. And if there's a mountain that's behind you, maybe 3 miles away, there's no atmosphere. So one of our visual cues to distance, whether you realize it or not, is how much of the atmosphere you can see between you and a mountain that's 3 miles away. It looks hazy, right? It looks faded because you can see the atmosphere. You can see the moisture and the dust in the atmosphere, unless it's an extremely clear day. But you're going to see a little bit of it. You don't have that on the moon because there's no atmosphere to create that. So if you're looking, you could move a few hundred yards and be in a different spot, but see the same background because it's not going to change. The perspective is not going to change that much, and you don't have the atmosphere giving you that visual cue that you've gotten closer or further away from a distant object. And then you've got the fact that there's no exhaust or flame on the ascent. Like the ascent video, it just kind of like popped up off the ground and took off. Now, if you only needed 1.5 psi to land, you didn't need a whole lot more to take off. And they used a fuel that didn't need a spark, so there was no flame, and it left no exhaust. Also, people say that you should see heat waves because the sun is heating up the moon. The moon is relatively hot. It should melt your film, or you should see heat waves coming off the surface. Well, you see heat waves on Earth when you're in the summer. When you look across the hood of a car, you can see the ripple effect come off it. You're actually seeing the air heating up. There's no air on the moon, so you're not going to see heat waves. And then as far as heating up the cameras or the film, again, they're coated in like all white to reflect as much of the solar radiation as possible to keep the heat down. And they're not touching the surface of the moon, so there's very little heat transfer from that. So then there's all the film and video evidence. Like, you can't see the stars in the photos or the videos. This is a basic concept of photography. You've got, these cameras were specially made. They had no setting changes on them. So they were easy to use for the astronauts who were wearing big gloves and working in a vacuum. So they didn't want to have them changing the aperture and all kinds of stuff. So they had one setting. And if you're taking a picture of something bright that's close up, like the moon or an astronaut in a spacesuit or a lunar lander, right? That's what you're going to see. And that light is going to be so much more overpowering than the comparatively dim light from stars. You won't see those show up in the picture because of exposure, right? Light, your lighting isn't going to allow that with a camera. Almost in the same vein as that, they say you can see things in the shadows that you shouldn't be able to see. If the sun is the only source of light on the moon, what's in the sunlight should be visible, and what's in shadow should be in complete darkness. That would be fine if you were in the vacuum of space, out away from any planetary body, a moon or a planet or anything like that. But we can see the moon from here. And it's not that we see the moon. We don't see anything. We see the light reflecting off of it. So we can see the moon because light reflects off of it. So if you're on the moon, you're going to have sunlight hitting the surface of the moon. It's going to be reflecting back, and it's going to reflect into those shadows, allowing you to see what's in the shadows. Speaking of shadows, they say that some shadows didn't line up, so there had to be photo editing involved. This has been disproven so many times. The angle of a shadow has a lot to do with where the light source is. So you got the light source, then you've also got the angle of the terrain that shadow is cast on. Can change the angle slightly. That doesn't mean that the photo's been edited in any way. It just means that it's in a weird spot, that there's weird hot spots in the photo, so there must be studio lighting off on the side. So this can be contributed to a couple things. You've got a lot of bright reflective things around you, the moon included, spacesuits, the lunar rover, all kinds of stuff could be causing reflections into the camera. It's called lens flare. It happens. It depends on where the sun is. The camera is mounted to their chest, so maybe their hands are in the wrong spot and it's creating a flare. There's a lot of things that can cause that. And it doesn't mean that it's faked. The crosshairs in some of the photos are hidden behind objects that they're taking a photo of, so therefore they must be edited in. So the crosshairs are etched into the glass of either the lens or the mirror in the camera. And I don't know how they did it in this particular camera, but it's usually either in the lens or in the mirror, so that it's always in the photo. It actually shows up as part of the photo, and you can use it for reference. So there are some photos that when you look at them, they appear the crosshair disappears behind them. There's a couple reasons for this. If you've ever taken a photo, again, you know that contrast is a tricky thing, especially in high contrast areas where you got a lot of light, like the sun reflecting off the moon or an astronaut, and then the shadows and the dark areas in the background, depending on how your camera's set up. Now, if you've got something etched into glass, well, that etching is going to bend the light a little bit, which could cause it to wash out in high contrast areas, or just the photo itself is going to wash out that etching in the light area. Now you take into account that the original photos that were sent back to Earth were low res, and a lot of people use those for their evidence. You didn't get the higher res photos until the cameras came back to Earth because they were film. And then even at that, if you're making a copy of a photo, anytime you make a copy of a copy of a copy of a copy, you start to lose integrity of the photo. So if you've got an already high contrast area where something is getting washed out, you may take a copy of that and it's going to be gone completely. You're never going to see it. Doesn't mean it's edited. It just means that's the way that photos work. Some of the photos show the flag looks like it's waving, and there's a video clip that shows that the flag move when it shouldn't. The photos, I'm not sure if this is people just misunderstanding what they're seeing, but I mean, obviously there's no atmosphere on the moon. There's no wind. And even on Earth, like flags don't just stick out because there's air. There's got to be wind holding it out. So since there's no chance of that on the moon, they put wires in the flag to hold it out, to make it look like it's waving. That one's pretty self-explanatory. I thought that one would be pretty easy. But in the video clip, there is a short video clip where I think it's Armstrong is in the video and he's turning towards the camera. And as he turns towards the camera, you kind of see the flag move a little bit. Upon further investigation, they found that it's not the flag moving at all, but the camera actually like adjusts, it settles to one side. So they've taken that clip and they've used the flagpole and horizon to create fixed spots. And when they do that, you can see the flag stays still, the camera moves. That you can find online. Now, of course, somebody's gonna say that's edited and they're just hiding the truth. But the simple answer is the camera moved, not the flag. There's a picture that Neil Armstrong took of Buzz Aldrin, and he's standing in front of him and takes a picture, and you can see the reflection in Aldrin's face visor of Armstrong. And people say, who took the picture? He's not holding the camera. Armstrong's not holding a camera. Who took the picture? It must be a studio shot, or it's edited in some way. Well, as I mentioned a couple minutes ago, the cameras are mounted to the spacesuit. They're not holding it in hand. Again, you're not on vacation with your DSLR holding up to your eye, taking a picture of a waterfall. You're doing work on the moon. Like, they weren't carrying a camera around with them in their hands. They had it mounted to their chest mount to their spacesuit. And in that picture, you can clearly see his hands are up at his chest. He's taking the picture there. It's not, even if somebody else was taking the picture, they're not in the, where are they? They're not in the reflection either. It's mounted to the suit. More photos. Some people claim that more photos were taken than should have been, given the technology of the cameras they used. So again, as I mentioned before, the cameras already had preset settings. They couldn't change them, and they were designed to take more photos than you would think. All right, so I guess they say these cameras were designed to take 2 photos a minute. There must be some kind of processing that goes on in the camera, so it's already processed. You don't have to worry about the negatives being taken through space. I'm not sure how that worked, but even at that, they would say, well, there's like still twice as many pictures. There was 2 astronauts. They both had cameras. There's your discrepancy right there. And then who filmed Armstrong? This is my favorite. Who filmed Armstrong coming down the ladder? There is a picture that is often attributed to the photo of Armstrong coming down the ladder for the first time. It is not. They went in and out of the lunar module several times during that 21-hour period they were on the moon for, like I said before, breaks, changing gear, eating, sleeping, things like that. One of those photos was taken by Aldrin when Armstrong was either coming down or going up the ladder. And they get credited a lot as the photo of him coming down. It's not. So on the lunar module itself was a module called the MESA. I don't remember what it stood for, but it was basically where they put all their gear. So when they landed, they were able to deploy this MESA from the bottom of the lunar module. And one of the things they had on there was the camera that was set up and all ready to record. And it's pointed right at the ladder. There is no photo of him coming down, but there is video of him coming down from that camera. So it was already running when they launched the MESA. They recorded him coming down. So who filmed Armstrong? The lunar lander did. And then finally, But this isn't really evidence. It's just a kind of a conspiracy within a conspiracy. But there is a belief that NASA hired Stanley Kubrick to film the moon landings. So NASA went through the process, went through all the money of building these rockets, launching them as tests to make people think we were testing rockets, and then launched them to make people think we went to the moon, bringing them back down, quarantining the astronauts, and then faking the moon landings in a studio that the landings were filmed by Stanley Kubrick. Because the year before Apollo 11, Stanley Kubrick released 2001: A Space Odyssey. And in that film, there are scenes that are shot, obviously, in a movie studio of the moon. And they are pretty well done. So people assume that NASA went to Kubrick and hired him to film this because he did such a good job in 2001. But if you look at the 2001 footage and the Space Odyssey, the movie 2001: Space Odyssey, and the actual moon landing footage, there are clear differences. And people have tried to recreate the moon landing, and you can get close in some things, but you can't get it perfect. And the physics as he showed it in 2001 does not match up with what you see in the moon landing. So it's not exact. So just because he filmed a movie about the moon before we went to the moon doesn't mean he recorded the moon landings in the studio. The funny twist of this is that NASA didn't hire him to film the moon landings, but he hired astrophysicists and people familiar with the space program to help him as consultants in 2001. Now, no one had been to the moon yet, but they knew how things should act. So that's how he got it so close. There's a darker twist to this, though, that maybe these discrepancies are indicators that it was faked and it was done on purpose. Because if you're a director or a producer, you're involved in movies, you're going to want to put your best work out, especially for something like this. And there's a lot of things that people are picking apart as indiscrepancies. Maybe they were put in there on purpose, because there is a conspiracy that says that NASA blackmailed Kubrick into doing these by threatening to uncover his brother as a communist sympathizer, his brother Raoul as a communist sympathizer. And when you think of it that way, you go, well, no, hold on a second. So this guy, somebody came to him and said, look, you're going to do these, or we're going to let the world know that your brother's, a communist sympathizer. Then maybe he would put some hints that it was fake, just so people knew, like, I'm doing this under duress. There's a huge problem with this, though. Stanley Kubrick doesn't have a brother, Raoul, and he never did. So they didn't blackmail him with a fictitious brother. That didn't happen. If you look at future, like just relatively recent, I guess within like the last 5 years, we've had a lunar orbiter going around the moon. And it has sent back photos of the landing sites, complete with where the landing modules are. You can see tracks, and they're still there from the rovers. You can see where equipment has been left behind. I think it's Apollo, the one I saw, I think was Apollo 17 and Apollo 11 they showed, where they could actually see where things were, especially the tracks. It's very interesting to see the tracks back and forth from the lunar rover. It's pretty cool. So either that's been, there's a lot of stuff that have to be faked. So maybe the moon is a hologram and all they did was upload an image of some landing sites. So just in case people look, they can see it. I don't think so. I think we went to the moon. I think we landed on the moon. And people they're looking for a conspiracy that's not there. If you can give me a good reason why they would lie about going to the moon that would still be valid today, let me know. Because Vietnam, the space race, and money, they don't cut it. The evidence doesn't cut it. And the theory that Kubrick filmed it doesn't cut it. I mean, I know we launched stuff into space. I was lucky enough to see the space shuttle. Like the last 10 space shuttles go up. You see them launch. They leave sight. And I saw a couple like right at sunset. So you'd see the shuttle go into space. And then, like 45 minutes later, you'd see it come around. And you see it. I mean, it's up there. It's at least really high. We were sending stuff up somewhere. Why would we lie about going to the moon? I don't know. Hope you guys enjoyed this one. I know there's a lot in there. Jason, I hope you liked it. Check us out, iTunes, Google Podcast, Spotify, Stitcher, Podcast Addict, the RSS feed, or on YouTube. All different ways to get the podcast, watch it, listen to it, whatever you want to do. Hope you guys liked it. Think more. See you in episode 405.